Up to the age of 12, the most of my early memories are positive. Everything changed at that point. That morning seems like it was yesterday. Mom was crying in their bedroom as my dad packed his bags. Confusion and fear gripped me as I watched him carry two heavy suitcases down the stairs to my room. Nothing, no hug goodbye, no explanation. Just the sound of his car starting up in the driveway and the door closing. His silver Honda vanished down our street as I hurried to the window, expecting him to turn around, but he didn't. Later that day, I saw Mom in the kitchen, her eyes puffy and red from sobbing. Why did Dad leave? I inquired in the hopes that she might explain everything to me. I jumped when she slammed her coffee mug down. Because, Shayla, he's a horrible, self-centered person. He refused to even pay child support after abandoning his own child. Your father is a man like that. Back then, I had no idea what child support was, but I was alarmed by Mom's resentment. She was unlike anything I had ever seen. She abruptly interrupted me when I attempted to ask further questions. Just put him out of your mind. He is not deserving of our tears. I couldn't get Dad out of my head at first. At night, I would lie awake wondering whether I had done something wrong or if I was to blame for this. He never called or showed up at my school, despite my repeated expectations. The discomfort became less intense as the weeks stretched into months. He was a traitor who had deserted us, and Mom was correct. In an attempt to be the ideal daughter for Mom, I immersed myself into my studies and activities. After Dad left, she felt so broken, and I wanted to cheer her up. Together, we established new routines. She occasionally allowed me to assist Mom in the garden on the weekends, and on Fridays we would have movie and pizza nights. Although things had changed, we were getting by. Then, almost 2 years after Dad's departure, Mom began dating once more. At that point, Steve came into our life. At first, he was pleasant enough, asking about my school, taking Mom out to dinner, and bringing her flowers. But now that I think about it, I should have recognized the warning signs. About 3 months into their relationship, he stated one evening, "Your mom tells me you've been staying out late with your friends." Despite his informal tone, I felt uneasy about something in his gaze. "Just until 6, I replied. Mom said it was okay. His smile fell short of his eyes. "Well, from now on, things will be a little different around here. A girl of 14 needs structure." When I looked at Mom, I thought she may say something to defend me. But instead, she just gave Steve a loving smile and squeezed his hand. The subtle change in the ground beneath my feet, like if everything I knew was about to change again, was the first thing I felt. When Mom and Steve were married, everything in my life changed. First of all, there was a rigorous curfew. I had to go home by precisely 5:00 p.m. without exception. Next came the chore chart, which listed all of the things I had to do every day. Steve would ground me if I missed even one thing. When he insisted that I clean the entire kitchen by 6:00 p.m. every day, I objected, saying, "But I have volleyball practice after school on Thursdays." "Then you'll have to quit volleyball," Steve stated bluntly. "Your responsibilities at home come first." Mom only nodded in agreement when I looked to her for encouragement. "Honey, Steve is correct. You will become like your father if we don't teach you discipline." She started using that line whenever I voiced my displeasure. "Or you'll end up like your father." Every time, it hurt and I felt bad for even challenging Steve's regulations. The rules continued to accumulate. I have to stop using my phone after 8 p.m. Steve had to keep an eye on me as I completed my schoolwork at the kitchen table. I was rarely allowed to hang out with friends without permission. My clothing even became a problem. Before I departed for school, Steve asked that I get his approval for my attire. One day, I came home 10 minutes late, because my biology teacher wanted to discuss my project after class. Steve was waiting at the door, his face red with anger. "Where were you?" he demanded. Mr. Peterson needed to talk. "No excuses," he cut me off. "You're grounded for 2 weeks. Hand over your phone." "But that's not fair," I protested. I was talking to a teacher. "3 weeks now," he said, holding out his hand. "Want to make it 4. I watched this whole exchange from the kitchen doorway, saying nothing. Later, when I tried to explain to Mom what happened, she just sighed. "Steve is trying to teach you responsibility, Sheila, something your father never did." Things got even more complicated when Mom announced she was pregnant. She was beaming with joy, and Steve couldn't stop grinning. I tried to be happy for them, but something in my gut told me things were about to get worse. My half-brother Tommy was born when I was 15 and a half. He was cute, I'll give him that, but his arrival turned my life upside down. Suddenly, I wasn't just responsible for my usual chores. I became an unpaid babysitter. "You need to watch Tommy while we go out," Mom would say, already putting on her coat. "But I have a history test tomorrow." "Family comes first," Steve would interrupt. "Besides, we're supporting you since your father doesn't send any money. The least you can do is help out." I watched them go on their dinner dates while I sat home with Tommy, trying to study with a crying baby. Steve bought Tommy designer clothes and expensive toys, while I was told we couldn't afford new school supplies. When Tommy cried at night, I was the one who had to get up and check on him, even on school nights. "He's your brother," Mom would say when I complained about being exhausted. "And since your father doesn't pay alimony, you need to contribute to this household." By the time I turned 16, I was sick of hearing about how much of a financial burden I was. Every time Steve or Mom opened their mouths, it was about how much they had to spend on me. So I decided to do something about it. There was this small cafe near our house, the Morning Brew, that was always looking for help. I walked in one afternoon after school and talked to the manager, Sarah. She must have seen something in my eyes because she hired me on the spot. The pay wasn't great, minimum wage plus whatever tips I could get, but it was something. I worked from 4 o'clock to 8 o'clock p.m. on weekdays and longer shifts on weekends. The next 2 years were brutal. I'd wake up at 6 o'clock a.m. to take care of Tommy, go to school, work at the cafe, come home to more chores and Tommy duty, then try to squeeze in homework somewhere between everything else. My grades started slipping. There just weren't enough hours in the day. When graduation came around, I was devastated to learn I didn't have enough points for a scholarship. I remember sitting at our kitchen table, acceptance letter in hand, trying to explain to Mom and Steve about the tuition costs. "Maybe we could figure something out together," I suggested, hopefully. "I could work more hours, and if you could help with just part of it." Steve laughed. Actually laughed. "You should have thought about that before letting your grades drop," he said. "We don't have money for your college," Mom added, bouncing Tommy on her knee. "If you'd studied harder instead of hanging out with your work friends all the time." I ended up taking an entry-level position at Wilson Trading Company. The hours were long, the work was mind-numbing, and my supervisor, Mr. Peters, seemed to take pleasure in pointing out every tiny mistake I made. But it was a real job with a real paycheck. Then came the bombshell. After my 3rd paycheck, Steve called a family meeting. "Now that you're working full-time," he said, "it's time you started paying rent." I stared at him in disbelief. "But I already give Mom money for groceries," I said. "That's for food," Mom jumped in. "This would be for your room, utilities, everything else." They had it all calculated, a number that would eat up almost half my monthly salary. I wanted to argue, to point out how unfair it was, but what choice did I have? My salary wouldn't cover rent anywhere else in town, not with food and other expenses. The next 2 years felt like being trapped in quicksand. Every month, I handed over a chunk of my salary, watching Steve and Mom spend money on Tommy's private swimming lessons and expensive toys while I wore the same clothes I'd had since high school. But I kept my head down and worked hard. Mr. Peters eventually noticed, and when a supervisor position opened up, he recommended me for it. The raise that came with the promotion wasn't huge, but it was enough to finally get out. I found a small one-bedroom apartment across town. It wasn't much. The paint was peeling, and the neighbors were loud, but it was mine. The day I moved out, Mom barely looked up from helping Tommy with his homework. "Make sure you leave your key," was all she said. Living on my own wasn't easy. The apartment was small and needed repairs I couldn't afford, but at least it was mine. I kept working at Wilson Trading, taking every overtime shift I could get. Still, after rent, utilities, and basic necessities, there was barely anything left to save. I'd watch my coworkers with college degrees moving up the corporate ladder while I stayed stuck in the same position. My boss had even told me directly, "Sheila, you're one of our best workers, but without a degree, there's only so far you can go here." College remained this distant dream. I'd sometimes browse university websites during my lunch break, calculating tuition costs and always coming up short. Every scholarship I found required either better high school grades than I had or full-time student status, which I couldn't afford. Mom and Steve rarely called. When they did, it was usually Mom asking if I was coming to Tommy's school events or soccer games. I usually made up excuses. I couldn't bear watching Steve beam with pride while my mother fawned over her perfect son. Then came that night, just after my 22nd birthday. I was heating up leftover Chinese food when someone knocked on my door. When I looked through the peephole, my heart stopped. There he was, my father, looking 10 years older than he should. "Sheila," his voice was exactly as I remembered it. "Please, can we talk?" My first instinct was to slam the door in his face. How dare he show up after 10 years? But something in his appearance made me pause. He looked sick, almost frail. "5 minutes," I said, keeping the door chain on. "That's all I ask," he replied, and something in his voice made me remove the chain. He sat at my small kitchen table, his hand shaking slightly as he declined my automatic offer of coffee. Up close, he looked even worse, pale and thin, nothing like the strong, competent man from my childhood memories. "I need to tell you why I left," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not your biological father." The words hit me like a physical blow. I sat down hard in the chair opposite him. "What?" I whispered. "I had suspicions," he continued, his voice steady now. "Your mother had been acting strange, protective of her phone. I found messages. I did a DNA test. When I confronted her, she confessed to having an affair." My head was spinning. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. "She begged me to forgive her," he went on, "but I couldn't stay. Every time I looked at you, I saw her betrayal. It wasn't fair to you. You were innocent in all this, but I couldn't handle it. But I always paid the alimony. I couldn't be there for you, but I made sure you were taken care of financially." "What do you mean you paid alimony?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Mom always said you never sent a penny. She and Steve kept telling me I had to help with Tommy and pay rent because you weren't supporting me." Dad, or I guess, not really my dad, reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. Inside were bank statements, years of them, showing monthly transfers to my mother's account. $22,000 every month without fail, he said quietly. I set up automatic payments the day I left. I stared at the papers, my hands trembling. Each statement showed the same thing: regular monthly payments, all clearly labeled child support. Sheila, years of them, tens of thousands of dollars that I'd never seen a cent of. I felt sick. All those years of being told I was a burden, of working at the cafe while trying to study, of paying rent to my own mother while she had been receiving money meant for me every single month. "Why are you here now?" I asked, pushing the statements away. After all this time? He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, suddenly looking even more frail. "I have some news, Sheila. 2 pieces, actually. First, I can't have children. Secondly, I'm dying, Sheila. Cancer. Doctors give me 2 years at most." I sat there stunned. This man, who I'd spent years hating, who I'd blamed for everything wrong in my life, was sitting at my kitchen table telling me he was dying. "After I left, I threw myself into work," he continued. "Made some smart investments. I've done well for myself, very well. But I have no family, no children of my own. And despite everything, despite not being your biological father, I've never stopped thinking of you as my daughter." "What are you saying?" I asked. "I want to make you my heir, Sheila. Everything I have, the house, the investment properties, my savings. I want it all to go to you." The room started spinning. I gripped the edge of the table, trying to process what he was saying. This man, who I thought abandoned me, had been supporting me all along. And now he was dying and wanted to leave me his fortune. "I need time to think about this," I managed to say. He nodded and stood up slowly. "Of course. Here's my card. Call me when you're ready to talk." I walked him to the door in a daze. Before he left, he turned to me one last time. "For what it's worth, Sheila, I'm sorry. Not for leaving your mother. She made her choices. But I'm sorry for leaving you. I should have found a way to tell you the truth." I barely slept that night. By morning, I knew what I had to do. I drove to Mom and Steve's house, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. Tommy was at school, and Steve's car wasn't in the driveway. Perfect. Mom answered the door in her gardening clothes, looking surprised to see me. "Sheila, what are you doing here?" "We need to talk," I said, walking past her into the house. The living room looked exactly the same. Tommy's toys everywhere, his school photos dominating the walls. "Dad came to see me yesterday," I said. Mom froze halfway to the couch. "What?" "Yeah, interesting conversation. He wants to make me his heir. Apparently, he's done pretty well for himself." "He what?" Mom's face turned red. "After abandoning you. After refusing to pay a cent in child support. And you're just going to forgive him because he's got money now." I couldn't help it. I started laughing, a harsh, bitter laugh that made Mom take a step back. "That's funny, Mom. Really funny. Because he showed me his bank statements. Every single month for 6 years, $2,000 in child support payments. Where did all that money go, Mom?" "Because it sure didn't go to me." The color drained from her face. "Sheila, hi, and that's not even the best part." I continued pulling the bank statements from my bag. He also told me why he really left, about the DNA test, about your affair. Mom sank onto the couch, her hands shaking. "You don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly. You cheated on him, got pregnant with me, and then lied about it for years. Then when he found out and left, you lied some more. You took his money, money meant for me, and used it for yourself and your new family. I needed that money, Mom." Suddenly, she burst out. "Do you know how hard it was being a single mother? And then when Tommy came along—" "Don't you dare try to justify this," I shouted. "You made me work through high school. You made me pay rent. You watched me struggle to save for college while you had thousands of dollars of my money sitting in your account. Mom's shock transformed into anger. I raised you. I took care of you. And now you're going to side with him because he's dangling his money in front of you. Side with him. He might not be my biological father, but at least he was honest with me, which is more than I can say for you. She stood up, her face hard. If you accept his money, we're done. Do you understand me? You'll no longer be welcome in this family. I looked around the room at Tommy's toys, at the family photos that I wasn't in, at this house where I'd never felt at home. That's rich, Mom, really rich. You made it clear years ago that I wasn't part of this family. The only difference now is that I finally understand why. I walked out of the house, letting the door slam behind me. Mom didn't try to stop me. I was at work when my phone started blowing up with notifications. Carol had texted, "Have you seen your mother's Facebook post?" I waited until my lunch break to look. There it was, a long paragraph about her ungrateful daughter who had abandoned her loving family for a deadbeat dad's money. Mom had really outdone herself with the drama, painting herself as the sacrificing single mother and me as the greedy, heartless child. The comments were even worse. I can't believe Sheila would do this to you after everything you've done for her. She always was a difficult child. Money changes people. My relatives, people who hadn't bothered to contact me in years, were suddenly experts on my life. My hand shook as I started typing my response. Since Mom wants to air our family drama on Facebook, let's tell the whole story. Let's talk about how she cheated on Dad and lied about me being his daughter. Let's talk about the DNA test that made him leave. And while we're at it, let's talk about the $22,000 monthly child support payments he made for 6 years. Money I never saw a cent of. I have the bank statements to prove it. Where did all that money go, Mom? I attached photos of the bank statements, making sure to blur out the account numbers, but leaving the payment amounts clear. The response was immediate. The same relatives who had been condemning me minutes earlier were now flooding Mom's post with questions. Is this true, Sarah? What's going on? $22,000 a month for 6 years? That's $14,000. Mom deleted her post within hours. My phone kept ringing with calls from relatives, but I ignored them all. Instead, I pulled out Dad's business card and dialed his number. We met for dinner that weekend. It was awkward at first. Minus 10 years is a long time, but somehow it felt right. He told me stories about his business ventures, and I told him about my job. When I mentioned my dream of going to college, his eyes lit up. "Let me help," he said. "It's the least I can do after all these years." 2 weeks later, I was enrolled in evening management classes at the local university. For the first time, I felt like my life was moving forward instead of standing still. Dad and I started having weekly dinners. Sometimes we talked about the past, about what really happened. Other times we just talked about normal things, work, school, movies. He wasn't my biological father, but he was becoming something just as important, a real parent. Mom tried calling a few times after I exposed her lies, but I let it go to voicemail. Steve sent a text about tearing the family apart. I blocked his number. Tommy asked me at the grocery store why I didn't come to his games anymore. That one hurt, but I just wasn't ready to deal with any of them. Those 4 years with Dad were a gift I never expected to have. The doctors had given him 2 years at most, but he was always stubborn. "I'm not going anywhere until I see you graduate," he'd say. And somehow he made it happen. We made the most of our time together. Between my evening classes and his treatments, we'd meet for dinner at least twice a week. He told me stories about his life, his business ventures, and even shared old photos from when I was little. Sometimes we just sat in comfortable silence, watching old movies or sharing a pizza. He said one evening about a year after we reconnected, "I spent 10 years regretting leaving you. Even after I found out you weren't biologically mine, I never stopped loving you as my daughter." I remember squeezing his hand, unable to speak through the tears. He came to all my college presentations, sat proudly in the front row, even when he was too weak to stand for long. During his better days, he taught me about business, about investing, about all the things he'd learned building his fortune. The past few months have been difficult. He was in the hospital more often than not because the cancer had spread. In order to be with him, I took time off work to sit in the uncomfortable hospital chair next to his bed and study for my finals. He'd remark, "You don't have to stay. Try and make me leave," is what I would respond. Despite having to watch via video conference from his hospital room, he was present during my graduation. I was still wearing my gown and cap when I brought my diploma to him immediately following the ceremony. His eyes gleamed with pride, but his grin was feeble. Whispering, "I always knew you could do it," he said. He vanished 2 weeks later. When he passed away, I was holding his hand and telling him about my new work offer and how I would apply what he had taught me. A lovely suburban home, 2 apartments in the heart of the city, and enough cash to keep me from ever working again, if I so desired, were all part of the enormous bequest. But the truth he had given me, the love he had shown me, and the teachings he had taught me were more priceless than all of that. I rented out the house and one of the flats, and I moved into the other one. I continued my employment despite the fact that the rental revenue more than covers my expenses. I learned the importance of creating something for myself from my father. By proposing Christmas get-togethers or family reunions with Mom, Steve, and Tommy, some of my relatives continue to attempt to mediate conflicts. I always say no with grace. I tell them I've made my peace with the past when we get together for holiday dinners, which I carefully plan to have when I know Mom will be present. But that doesn't mean I need to revisit it. They no longer argue, or at least they understand. Aunt Carol even expressed regret for taking Mom's Facebook post at its value without considering my perspective. Uncle Jim acknowledged that he had long harbored suspicions regarding the child support funds, but had kept them to himself. Tommy, who is taller now and increasingly resembles Steve every day, occasionally plays in the yard when I drive by my former home. Mom continues to live there with her ideal small family, sharing pictures of them on Facebook. Seeing them no longer makes me angry. Really, I don't feel anything at all. I learned from my dad that family isn't just about blood. It's about honesty, love, and the decision to support someone through difficult times. Both when he re-entered my life and when he married Mom, he made the decision to be my father. I value that more than any biological kinship could.